Welcome back, Chappelle. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your flipped classroom and our continuing discussion of Napoleon Bonaparte, right? Yes, we are still all up in that French Revolution right now. We are now currently in what is known as the Napoleonic phase, right? And we're about midway through that Napoleonic phase. The Napoleonic phase, of course, being characterized by the rule of this guy right here. That guy, Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon Bonaparte, the man from Corsica that would one day rise up to become Emperor of France, all right? So the big thing about it, though, that we left off talking about in class is about his earliest reign following the coup d'etat of 1799. Very nice. I like this now. I've done about 8 takes trying to get this intro right. I'm glad that we're here right now. Very good stuff. So let's keep going, though, talking about his early reign as the first consul of France. So remember what ended up happening? He came back from Egypt, right? He came back to a hero's welcome because everybody thought he was doing so good, even though they didn't know that he lost to Admiral Horatio Nelson, the one-armed, blind in one eye, amazing admiral of the entire British Navy that just doesn't lose naval battles to people like Napoleon, right? So that guy, of course, defeats him, but nobody knows about that defeat. Comes back to a hero's welcome, seizes on his popularity, and overthrows the French government. He overthrows the Directory and the Council of 500, and this thing known as the coup d'etat of 1799 creates a new government, calls himself the consulate, right? Calls it the consulate. Him and 2 other guys, names himself first consul, emulating the ideas of ancient Rome, right? He's a very big ancient Roman historian. He loves the ancient generals and stuff like that. Alexander the Greats, Julius Caesars. So he also tends to emulate them in a lot of really big ways, okay? Now the big thing about it, though, is while he is first consul, his economy is stabilizing. He's got major victories in Italy. Oh, by the way, we talked about this in class, how in Italy, to get to Italy, he had to cross the Alps, the big giant mountain range known as the Alps in northern Italy, to actually go into northern Italy and rid northern Italy of an Austrian army and also bring them underneath his rule and stuff like that. And look at this bad boy. Look at all the symbols of the revolution. He's wearing the tricolor cockade on his hat right there. He looks young. The cape is flowing in the background. This was done by Jacques-Louis David. And then look right here, the names on the rocks. Bonaparte, chiseled freshly and above all else, and then Hannibal right there, and then Carlos Magnus, or Charlemagne, written right there as well, placing himself in the great rule of many great people and great generals that had come before him, right? So the big thing about it, though, is like I said, his legend is growing, right? Now, in reality, he probably looked like this when he was crossing the Alps, because he was a little bit older, and he was probably on a mule, and it was probably really, really cold, because there's no way that Marengo would have survived that entire trip with him on his back. So, going into it, though, when he does this whole thing, when he wins major victories in Italy, while his legend is continuing to grow, he starts doing a lot of really big, important stuff and some very dicey things at the same time, right? He starts rigging elections so he makes himself consul for life, okay? That's a big one that went down. This is actually a thing called Plebiscite, or a dictatorship by plebiscite. He actually allowed the French people to vote on if they wanted him to be consul for the rest of his life. And it came back in an overwhelming, over 90% approval rating of a yes vote, right? Turns out, though, that it was a rigged election, and literally his brother had organized a way to falsify a bunch of the votes and stuff like that. So he just tried to make it appear to all the French people that, actually, everyone loves me, right? Which in reality, as we know from this other painting right here, not everybody loves you, big guy. He also is going to write a new constitution, which is a huge thing as well, because he's going to come into power, and when he writes this new constitution, he will increase his term limit and make himself a lifelong dictator, okay? That's a very dicey move as well, kind of demonstrates the fact that a man is power hungry and is coming to power and probably will never actually let it go. He's going to sell the Louisiana Territory to the United States for a whopping $15 million, right? So he's going to actually sell it for about $15 million bucks, and then also he's going to try to bring back slavery in several of his colonies, which is really screwed up. So big thing that we need to understand is that Napoleon is not necessarily a nice guy, okay? Remember, when we look at people through a historical lens, we tend to try and say good and bad, or evil and positive, or whatever you want to call it, right? Now, in the grand scheme of things, he's very important to the progression of European history, but he's not personally a good dude, right? Like, if I saw Napoleon in real life, I'd punch him in the face, all right? So, because he's very, very sexist and rude to women. He's also extremely racist, and he also brought back slavery in one of his colonies so he could make more money off of them. The colony itself is the colony that you now know of is Haiti, and we'll actually talk about it a little bit later in this class as well, talk about the slave revolt that actually turned Haiti into an independent nation while Napoleon was ruling and during the French Revolution. But he actually tried to bring it back after it had already been abolished, right? Like an absolute jerk. The Concordat of 1801 is a big one as well, though. Remember the whole cult of the supreme being thing? Remember that whole thing that actually went down when they illegalized or made illegal the Catholic Church for a little while? Well, he actually brings it back. He actually brings like the Catholic Church back into France using this thing called the Concordat of 1801. It says that y'all can operate here, but you have to also understand that bishoprics and taxing and stuff like that, and you're under the French rule as well, okay? And he also brings in this thing known as the Napoleonic Code. And the Napoleonic Code is a massive document of laws, okay? It is a civil law code, which is going to be one of the earliest of its type that actually gets added to every time something happens. As you can see, it's a very large text. Now, the Napoleonic Code was meant to solidify certain things about the revolution itself. It gave men more rights. It gave men more voting rights. It gave men more rights to property. It gave men more rights to property and freedom from the estates. It also did a lot of other dicey things as well. It stripped the rights of women away that they had actually earned during the revolution, right? Big thing that's going to end up happening is, if we remember, is that the Women's March on Versailles demonstrated the active involvement of women during the revolution. The thing about it, though, is the Napoleonic Code comes in and takes away a lot of the rights that they had already earned, right? So Napoleon, again, big in history, not a good dude, though, right? So, like, look, going forward, though, as well, when we talk about it, also, you have to understand that Europe is going to begin to see him as a threat because he's taken over an area in northern Italy. He's gobbling up some territory towards the Netherlands and stuff like that in the north of France. And so, basically, the entirety of Europe is going to get together and make a thing known as a coalition. And they're going to decide to attack him, right? So, the big thing about it, you need to know what a coalition is, okay? A coalition is a massive group of countries, okay? So, basically, what happened is Prussia, Austria, Russia, and a little bit of Great Britain as well, are going to start combining their armies together and combine coalition forces and start attacking France, right? Now, we've already talked about one of these wars before. We talked about the War of the First Coalition when they attacked France when it was still under the rule of the National Assembly and stuff like that, way long before Napoleon ever came into power. But in 1803, he's going to be attacked, and the Napoleonic Wars begin, okay? And so the thing about it, though, is he doesn't lose, right? He doesn't lose these wars. He actually is victorious in these wars. The French armies established occupation forces in areas like the Holy Roman Empire, which still exists at this time, and in northern Italy, which means something that, like, several kids said today in class, which I was very impressed with. If you actually take over little bits and pieces of other countries and you continue to expand and grow your empire, that means, oh, excuse me, I just gave you the answer. All right, so yeah, that means you're no longer a country, you are now an empire, right? Because he has now collected territory where there are non-French speaking people and territory he did not used to own. So he's now growing into what is known as the French First Empire. And all empires need an emperor, right? And so Napoleon crowns himself Emperor of France in 1804. He does this, one, politically to increase his power and clout, and he does it secondarily so he can actually write another new constitution where he becomes emperor, a hereditary ruler for the rest of his life, right? The big thing about it, though, is at this ceremony, which was a massive, huge ceremony where so many people came to Notre Dame in Paris to watch him be crowned emperor, right? The thing was, he even invited the Pope. There, right there, is Pope Pius, right there, sitting down on the ground, blessing the entire thing with his hands right there. But there's a really big moment that happens during this ceremony when Napoleon walks in and he's dressed like this, right? He actually walks in dressed like an emperor already. He's wearing a laurel wreath on his head, going through the ideals of the Roman emperors that had come thousands of years before him, right? He walks up to the front. Pope Pius IX takes the crown and begins to actually descend it on top of his head, saying a prayer and blessing it and stuff like that, trying to actually show that God will be the one that gives you this power. Napoleon stands up in the middle of the ceremony and yanks the crown out of the Pope's hands and turns around and places it on his wife's head. Now, some of you are like, oh, does this mean his wife is now the emperor? No. Why would Napoleon do this? One, he's already wearing a hat, and like a hat, like a laurel wreath with another crown on top would just look kind of silly, right? But also due to the fact that he's trying to exert power and control over the Catholic Church that has now been welcomed back into France, right? He's saying that no one will place this crown on my head. I will decide where the power actually lies, and he placed it on his wife's head instead, and his wife's name was Josephine, right? So Josephine, a woman that he actually had married in 1796, several years before he even became emperor and stuff like that. His long beloved, he apparently loved her so much much and was the woman that he loved for the rest of his life, even though they actually got divorced pretty soon after this entire event happened, right? They got divorced because she couldn't have kids, and she actually had children from another marriage before that. See, this is what I'm talking about his views of women. She actually had children from another marriage that had come before that. He actually forced one of his stepdaughters, who was like in her teens, to marry one of his brothers, who was 40-something, right? Joseph Bonaparte, which is disgusting because he basically viewed those stepdaughters as property, right? But he divorced Josephine and then ended up marrying a woman from Austria named Marie, and then what ends up happening is they have a child, and he's known as Napoleon II. But interesting little fact, as you can tell with these very detailed paintings and stuff like that, the same guy who painted this famous picture of the death of Marat, which of course is right here behind me in my classroom as well, is the same imperial court painter that would paint all of his paintings, making him look grandiose as the Napoleonic Wars continue to escalate, right? So as the Napoleonic Wars continue to escalate and Jean-Paul Marat is like, or not Jean-Paul Marat, excuse me, that guy's dead, as in Jacques-Louis David continues to paint these amazing portraits of this new emperor of France, everything starts going down, and Napoleon continually wins battle after battle after battle that he faces against different coalition forces, right? Now, he loses a handful, but it's a very small handful, right? He ends up losing, I think, 4 in the early coalition wars, and he ends up losing 4 towards the end of his reign, right? So the thing about it, though, in general, is Napoleon just keeps winning and occupying more and more territory. A good example of this is actually the Battle of Austerlitz, right? The Battle of Austerlitz, he actually shows up with his French Revolutionary Army and defeats a combined force of Austrians, Prussians, and Russians as well, using different tactics and flanking movements of artillery and gaining the high ground on a ridge in the middle of the battlefield, and uses lightning quick strikes and overwhelming force to take over this entire group and brings Prussia and Austria under the rule of the Napoleonic forces as well, right? Which is a really, really big moment in his career. There's just a couple of battles that he did lose, like a big one was the Battle of Trafalgar, right? Now, the Battle of Trafalgar, as you can tell, though, is a naval battle, so of course he lost, right? So, like, the big one is he actually, in the Battle of Trafalgar, tried to actually directly invade Great Britain, which was a terrible idea. Like, Napoleon, read a history book, my guy. Don't do that. The last time that happened was the Spanish Armada with Philip II, right? Don't do that. The last time the Spanish Armada tried to roll up on them, the British used fire ships, then there were storms off the backside of Ireland, and everything just went sideways. Don't try to directly invade England. No one ever does it. It never works out. The only one that's ever pulled it off is William, Prince of Orange, because he was invited to show up, right? So the thing that ends up happening, though, is like Napoleon's naval fleet is all but destroyed at the Battle of Trafalgar by what guy? Yet again. Yes, Admiral Horatio Nelson defeats him in battle yet again. But at this time, Admiral Horatio Nelson would actually get the worst injury of his career. We actually know that Admiral Horatio is the man lying on the ground right here dying, as we can see the the armless sleeve that is pinned to his jacket right here that signifies that it is him. What had actually happened at the Battle of Trafalgar, a French sharpshooter actually shot him, and it went through his shoulder blade and actually through his back and severed his spine, paralyzing him immediately. But they dragged him to his captain quarters, and he continued to give orders and lead the battle for several hours while he laid on the bed dying, right? So, man, Admiral Horatio Nelson is just like a military prowess and a half. Now, but the big thing about it, though, is as we can tell, he can't win naval battles, so he takes over everything he can on land. Everything outlined right here in red is the extent of the Napoleonic Empire, right? So the French First Empire took over this entire area right here, known as the Holy Roman Empire, and completely destroys it, right? Jot that down real quick. The Holy Roman Empire would cease to exist, okay? So the Holy Roman Empire, the HRE, which is this big middle area right here, which is now modern-day Germany, would cease to exist after Napoleon destroyed it in 1806, right? So basically what happened is he invaded, and Francis VI of the Holy Roman Empire, who would then actually be Francis I of Austria, ran away and stuff like that, and then literally when he ran away and abdicated the throne, he gets taken over, and Napoleon turns it into the Confederation of the Rhine, right? He brings Austria underneath his rule, he brings Prussia underneath his rule as a puppet state as well, and he just continues to grow his influence, and the man's just not losing. And this right here is actually like an image of Napoleon done again by Jacques-Louis David of him standing in front of one of his Napoleonic code drafts, in front of his swords, with his hand on the hilt right here of an object in his, there's like a mystery object in his hand. I can never remember what it is. I think it's like a looking glass or something like that. But the big thing about it is, look at him right there. Calm, cool, collected, with his hand in his shirt, and the twilight hours of him signing and drafting up many documents, looking like the hard-working general that he always would be. But he goes from this in about 1810 to looking like this by about 1814, right? What has happened to this guy? What is leading to his downfall? Where his downfall is pretty dramatic and pretty intense. Napoleon's downfall begins with 3 huge mistakes that he made, okay? 1 is known as the Continental System. 2 is known as the Peninsular Campaign. And the 3rd big mistake is the invasion of Russia. Big fella, don't invade Russia. Just don't. Like everybody in history that tries to do this, never really works out for him, right? Hitler tried to do it in World War II during the Operation Barbarossa. Didn't work for him either, right? Also, other people have done it in the past. The Poles did it actually during the falling of the Rurik dynasty. Don't do it, all right? It's just not a good idea. But the big thing about it is, let's start off with that first one, right? The Continental System, okay? So the number 1 big mistake that Napoleon made when he went from having all that land to starting slowly to lose it is when he enforced a trade embargo, right? So what the Continental System is when Napoleon attempted to set up a naval blockade of the entirety of Europe, right? He attempted to set up a blockade that would actually go all the way around Europe, as exemplified by this red dotted line right here, to actually prevent Great Britain from trading with anyone on the continent, right? So there was something going on in Great Britain at the time known as the Industrial Revolution by the time that this was happening. It was reaching its peak by that time, and there was a stream of products coming out of Great Britain, including cheap cotton textiles and other things that people on the continent wanted as well, like iron that is actually being created in their smelting factories in Great Britain as well. And all these different goods and ideas that are coming out of that country. Napoleon wants to stop that flow, and he wants to try and choke out Great Britain through their wallet. So the thing about it, though, is it doesn't really work because he doesn't have much of a navy left. After the Battle of Trafalgar, Admiral Horatio Nelson, in his dying breath, destroyed Napoleon's navy. And so he doesn't really have enough boats to even set the blockade up. So there's holes all over the place. And also, Britain doesn't really care about your blockade, right? So they're going to trade with whoever's going to actually buy products from them at this point. And secondly, they have colonies everywhere, so they can just sell to them if they need to, right? So the thing about it is that 2 countries in particular are going to stab is the word I'm looking for there, stab Napoleon in the back and trade with Great Britain anyway. And this includes Spain/Portugal, because technically Portugal was allowed to actually take over them anyway. You know what I mean? They were allowed to, but Napoleon said, Portugal, if you trade with them, I'm going to come and invade you and bring you into my empire as well. Well, Spain also did this as well and aided Portugal in the usage of actually trading along with Britain as well. But the biggest offender out of all of them was the country of Russia. The kingdom of Russia at the time actually traded with Britain as well. And this is going to make Napoleon furious because he's like, why are you doing this? I told you not to do this. He's getting a little too arrogant, right? And also there's this guy in the background named Charles Talleyrand that he actually was mean to and stuff. That's a whole other story for later on. But the big thing about it, though, when we're looking at it, is those countries traded with Britain when they weren't supposed to. So now he feels like he has to punish them, right? So Napoleon says, all right, Spain and Portugal, since you traded with Britain, I'm going to come after you, and when I'm done with them, I'm coming after Russia, okay? So he decides to try and invade both, and those are his other 2 big mistakes. The Peninsular Campaign is the invasion of Portugal and Spain, right? So it's that when France tried to attack Portugal for ignoring the Continental System. And over 6 years, what's going to end up happening, though, is Napoleon's forces were never going to get solid gains, they're never going to gain solid ground, and they're going to lose massive numbers of soldiers and battles to Spanish guerrillas. All right, so now, this is what we need to understand really quick, okay? The Peninsular Campaign was a failure for Napoleon and drastically weakened his continental forces because Spain decided that their people, the Spanish people, decided we will not fight Napoleon the way he wants to fight us. The way Napoleon wants to fight is in a battle like this. He wants you to line up in your uniforms on one side of a field. He wants him to line up in his uniforms on one side of a field. They want to exchange volleys, maybe some cannon fire, a little bit of cavalry action, a charge where we meet in the middle, and then we all move on with our day. Now, the thing about it, though, is that's not how Napoleon was going to get fought in Spain, right? They actually instead used guerrilla warfare tactics. Locals in towns and other areas would raid Napoleon's supply lines, unpronounced and unprompted, just like the Americans did in the American Revolution against the British, right? And you can actually see some different etchings right here. This is actually by Francisco Goya. This is actually literally a French soldier going to decapitate a Spanish guerrilla that's actually been arrested. And this is another Goya painting as the executions of May the 6th, where literally many guerrillas have been ousted out of this village in the background, and Napoleonic soldiers are putting them in front of a firing squad, right? So it's a very intense moment in history. The Peninsular Campaign lasts for several years, but is ultimately unsuccessful for Napoleon. But nothing is as unsuccessful as his terrible invasion of Russia in 1812. And I can't emphasize enough, this is the big one. All right, so this is the big one that destroys his army going forward. And the thing about it is we will talk all about this when I see y'all again in class, because you can't just breeze through the invasion of Russia. You got to really give it some emphasis. You got to talk about why you shouldn't invade Russia in the first place, and you got to talk about how Napoleon thought he had it covered, because he was like, look, I have 600,000 men in a military. I'll be fine, right? No Russian army can stand up to my grand army, which will be made up of conscripts from everywhere I've taken over, with 600,000 men. And he's like, oh, and also, I've got 10 cans to store food in now, and I've got winter clothes with 10 buttons. So take that, Russia. I got this covered. But we'll talk about the Russian response in class and why this invasion was an ultimate failure and sends Napoleon forever downward, right? I'll see y'all soon. Y'all have a good one.